Good evening. I think that these seats have, the reserved seating is now open. It's not on? Is it on? No? Mike, may I speak? Thank you. These seats that were previously reserved are now open, so if you don't have a seat, you can come up to the front. And we'll get started.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Christopher Hecox. I'm the Executive Director of the J. and Susie Gouge Performing Arts Center that's being built across the street here from the Jule Smith Museum of Fine Art. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I wanted to give a special introduction. Today is the official first day of our new Museum Director and Chief Curator, Cindy Malinek. Cindy is here this evening in the back. Let's all welcome Cindy. We're very happy to have Cindy join the Auburn family. Cindy, I can't wait to work with you and building the vision of the Arts District for Auburn University. Thank you so much for joining us and coming. So everyone, if you can, say hello to Cindy. Welcome her to Auburn as part of the Auburn family. And again, thank you, Cindy, for coming this evening. So without further ado, Scott Bishop, our Curator of Education, is going to start the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome, Cindy. I'm Scott Bishop, as Christopher said. I'm Curator of Academic and Public Programs here at JCSM. And before we hear from our guest, Sonia Clark, I want to recognize this occasion that brings us here tonight, which is the opening of the Triennial Department of Art and Art History Studio Faculty Exhibition. And just by the way, the faculty who are members who are exhibiting and also the art history faculty are wearing lapel flowers. So if you'd like to talk to any of them, you can recognize them in that way. JCSM is grateful for the generous support of the Alabama State Council on the Arts and the Alabama Bicentennial Commission, which presents this exhibition and the related catalog in recognition and celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Alabama statehood in 2019. For every exhibition, there is the behind-the-scenes activity that makes the galleries appear to have come together effortlessly. But of course, what we see is the culmination of years of planning, months of research, writing, and thinking, following up on paperwork and loans, hours of packing, unpacking, photographing, designing, producing, installing, and probably more things that I haven't thought of. And so, I thank the members of the JCSM staff who worked on this exhibition. Jessica Hughes, curatorial assistant, curated this exhibition. Thank you, Jessica, and kudos. Also, many thanks to Curator of Collections and Exhibitions Dennis Harper, Registrar Danielle Funderburk, Preparator Chris Carr, and his worthy assistant John David Carcacci. To the JCSM Design and Marketing Department for the production of the catalog, which also includes profiles of the art history faculty's research. I encourage each of you to pick up a copy of that. It's a really nice publication. The exhibition is two beautifully presented galleries rich with thoughtful works of art. JCSM's mission statement begins with the sentence, "Art changes lives." The Art Studio Faculty exhibition demonstrates the special connection between the Department of Art and Art History and JCSM. First and fundamentally, we share a history. If it were not for the courageous move in 1948 of Frank Appleby, head of the Department of Art at then Alabama Polytechnic Institute, to spearhead the effort to bid on 36 controversial paintings at the center of a quite public national scandal, there would be no Advancing American Art collection here at Auburn University. And Advancing American Art is, after all, the first driving impetus to establish a museum here on campus. Secondly, the department and JCSM are connected in our purposes to implement through the visual arts Auburn University's mission of instruction, research, and outreach. What a powerful testament this exhibition is to the faculty's commitment to their practice and research. There might be no better teacher than example, and this exhibition serves as an unparalleled opportunity for our students to see the creative efforts of their professors who somehow figure out how to go to the classroom and do their work and also become our practicing artists and researchers. Now I've lost my place. The studio faculty meet our students where they are, challenge them to think critically, solve problems, articulate their thoughts and intentions, all the while teaching them how to use media and craft to their fullest advantage. The art historians similarly train our students to understand and implement the lenses through which they can know, interpret, and contextualize works of art. Our students are learning that art can change the way we see, the way that we think, the way we know, and what we value. To the faculty of the Auburn University Department of Art and Art History, I want to take this opportunity on behalf of all of us at JCSM to congratulate you, to honor the good work you do. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Christopher McNulty. I'm the current chair of the Department of Art and Art History, and it is my great honor to introduce my friend and mentor, Sonia Clark, at this evening's lecture. Sonia Clark is currently professor of art at Amherst College. Previously, she was a distinguished research fellow at the School of the Arts at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she served as chair for the Craft and Material Studies Department. Before that, she worked as both an assistant and then an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I met her. She earned her MFA at the Cranbrook Academy of Art and was honored in 2011 with their Distinguished Alumni Award. She holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a BA from Amherst College, which awarded her an honorary doctorate, in 2015. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the United States Artist Fellowship, Pollock Krasner Award, the 1858 Prize from the Gibbs Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, the Art Prize Grand Jurors Award, an Anonymous Was a Woman Award, In addition, she's been awarded residencies at the Redgate Residency in China, the Camargo Foundation Residency in France, the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Residency in Italy, a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, and a residency at the Yaddo Colony in New York. Her work has been exhibited in over 350 museums and galleries in the Americas, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia. Some highlights from her 26-page CV include 1- and 2-person shows at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia, the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art in Winston-Salem, the Society for Contemporary Craft in Pittsburgh, the University of Michigan, George Mason University, and the Indianapolis Art Museum. She's also, of course, been included in many group exhibitions, which, for example, the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., the Frist Center for Visual Arts in Nashville, the Nasher Museum of Art in Durham, North Carolina, the Gibbs Museum in Charleston, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, and those are just some of the highlights from just the last 5 years. I first met Sonia when she was a tenure-track professor of design studies at the University of Wisconsin in the late 90s. While my MFA program was in a different silo of the university, I had the privilege of having her critique my work and the work of many in my cohort on several occasions. Her work and perspectives provided an important model for me as a developing artist. This was the heyday of critical theory and postmodernism, and it often seemed that makers and artists working with traditional craft media on the one hand, and artists interested in theory and culture on the other, had withdrawn to distant, irreconcilable corners. In their most extreme manifestations, there was a camp of artists and craftspeople who embraced an anti-intellectual approach to their practice that avowed, not unlike modernism, that their work had no relationship to the broader world of culture and history. At the other extreme, there were artists who, in their preoccupation with theory and content, shunned materiality and craft, and consequently ignored the multivalent meaning that was embedded in both. Artists in the first camp made work concerned only with the performance of technique and creation of form, while members of the second camp made work about complex and critical ideas that was so reified that it was barely, if at all, manifest in material and form. In contrast to these polarized approaches, Sonia provided a model of how to bridge these seemingly, at the time, intractable perspectives to weave together meaning and skillful making. Or, more accurately, through conversations and through her work, she showed me that these were not separate concerns. Skill was, I learned, not merely a means to manipulate material and impose form, but a mean to shape content as well. Furthermore, I learned that materials and objects are actors that have a voice that shapes, tests, complements, or confounds the artist's expressive means. From this perspective, the artistic process is an ongoing negotiation and collaboration with a complex, unfolding matrix of material, method, form, and content. In her own work, Sonia investigates how objects, most often textiles, act as what she calls cultural interfaces. Her work reveals how objects and materials can reflect or absorb our individual and collective stories, and in particular, our stories about our histories, our stories about our identities as Americans, and our stories about race. I find it particularly important and powerful work for our historical moment. I also think it is generous work and compassionate work. Generous because it aspires, as she's written, to help us better to see one another. Please join me in welcoming Sonia Clark.
Hi, everybody. So there are a couple of times when people introduce me and I think, oh crap, now I have to talk after that? That's my, perhaps not the nicest way of saying thank you. Thank you, Chris. That was a beautifully articulated way of what I try to do as an artist. Now what we'll do is we'll measure what he said against what actually happens, and we'll see what goes on. You all will be the judges of that. So I want to thank all of you who are responsible for me being here. I want to give a shout out to all of those of you who are either the students or the friends or the colleagues of the Barb Bundy, Noah Brewer, Annie Campbell, who is a VCU alum, yay, Allison Comstock, Wendy Desheen, Jonathan Durham, Alexandra Gianell, Chuck Himmard, Andy Holliday, Chris McNulty, and Lauren Woods. So we're here to celebrate their show, and I'm looking forward to being in the gallery with all of you later. Did a mic not get turned off up here? Yeah, I think we're okay. All right. So, a thread, a hair, a lineage. Let's see what I do in an hour to talk to you about those things. I want to share with you this. James Baldwin referred to art as a kind of a confession. And then he goes on to describe how if art is a confession, it allows us to examine and face each one of our lives so that we can determine how we are connected to other lives. And then how those others can discover the terms by which they too are connected to other people. So my confession, there will be many this evening, is that everything that you need to know about me, and I mean everything, like everything that follows, you can discern from this slide. But I am going to show you more than this slide. There are 39 more to come. Anyway, this is my grandmother, my strong, beautiful Jamaican maternal grandmother. Chummy is what we called her. We all called her Chummy. Her friends called her Chummy. Her children called her Chummy. Her grandchildren called her Chummy because she was everyone's chum, that is to say, everyone's friend. Our itinerant grandmother visited her children and grandchildren in these places: Jamaica, of course, Ghana, the UK, and the United States of America. Note that these were all places that once were part of the British Empire, and also all places that were part of the transatlantic slave trade routes. Chummy belonged to all of us. She connected all of us. Jimmy Baldwin would be proud of her. She connected us through the stories that she told us. She would travel from place to place to place, gathering our stories and then offering them up to one another, to each one of us. So I knew my cousins very well through the stories that Chummy held about them. When you're looking at this photograph, I want you to note that her hands are at this Singer sewing machine. She was a tailor by trade. And in fact, being a milliner, which is one of the things that she did, saved her life. If there's time, I'll tell you how. She could make magic with this sewing machine. I also want you to note the white afro that she is rocking. As a child, I thought of Chummy's mind as being like a mountain of knowledge, breathing wise white clouds into the sky and into me personally. I thought of her hair as being a nest of wisdom, and I actually long and covet for this white afro. So I'm 51, and I have a little bit of white hair, but this is what I want. Apparently, the more you want it, the less you get it. I don't know. And those of you, I can see you out there, my white-haired friends that I am covetous of. But here's the thing, mine is coming very slowly, and I believe that one has to earn white hair to earn the wisdom. So clearly, you're going to be subjected to an hour of someone who's not very wise. My apologies. Chemi would always say, come stitch with me and I'll tell you a story. We'll put our stories into our stitches. She was my teacher in my formative years. And you hear me going on about this when our lives only crossed for a decade. I was born in 1967. My beloved grandmother died in 1977. But she's the basis of who and how I am on this planet and who I am as an artist. She taught me something about hair and stories and textiles, infused me with a sense of cultural pride and social justice. The second person that I want to talk to you about this evening is Chemi's daughter, Lilith Clark, my mother. My mother passed away, as I whispered into her ear, on August 27th last year. My mother, being born and bred in Jamaica, had this thing that she would always share with my sister and me, and that was, be very careful about, first of all, who does your hair and what happens with the hair in your hairbrush or when you cut your hair. You have to dispose of it properly. There's some Southerners here who are like, mm-hmm, right? Okay. Now I have to tell you, when I tell this story up north, I have to explain that while that sounds like some sort of superstitious kind of thing, that what my mother was conjuring is something that we all know, like from watching CSI or any of those crime television shows, that you do not want your DNA to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That said, my mother was quite troubled that I started making work out of hair. But yet, she showed her support of my work by always saving her hair, her salt and pepper hair, and giving it to me in a bag whenever we would meet. This piece is a piece in which, it's a photograph, in which, lives as a photograph, in which my studio assistant, Meg Arsenovic, and I, this is why Meg has a job in my studio, because she enjoyed doing this. She separated the dark hair from the white hair along my side. That meant having a white sheet of paper and a black sheet of paper so you could see where the white hair was and where the dark hair was. And Meg, being a better artist and having much higher quality control for my own work than I do, would actually snip hairs where the white hair turned to black. Yeah, she's going to have a job for life. The piece is called Mom's Wisdom or Cotton Candy because of the reference not only to cotton candy, both of the sugarcane fields of my mother's homeland in Jamaica, but the sweetness of her wisdom tucked into her ever-fleeting memory. Just for a moment, we're going to talk about a little tiny bit of theory, but I promise it won't hurt. It'll just be like a pinch. That's what the doctors say, right? I want to talk to you about a theorist by the name of Roland Barthes, who talked about a way of reading an image. And he divided the way of reading images into these two words, studium and punctum. Studium, I often point to my head, like it's the way that all of us could read this image. I think we'd all agree that this is either someone doing someone's hair or someone getting their hair done, something like that, right? No one's surprised by that reading. So studium reading, it's what a cultural group would agree what they see in an image. And a punctum reading is, punctum being the other side of this, is a very, very, very personal reading, like something that gets inside the photograph and sort of inside the skin of the viewer and perhaps isn't a very common reading. So this is a photograph that I've had in my studio for a long time. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know who took it. If someone does, kindly tell me, but I don't know who took it. But when I saw this photograph, it reminded me of this. That was when I was young and cute. I'm about 7 in this photograph. And the photograph on the left reminded me of being a child in the 70s, growing up in Washington, D.C., growing up across the street from a very grand home. We grew up in a Rambler, which was, it wasn't a big, fancy home. It was a nice home, comfortable home. But across the street was this grand stone mansion. And in that grand stone mansion lived a family of 14. And the 14 people who lived in that home were the Ajebades. The Ajebades were a family from what was then the Republic of Dahomey and now is the West African nation of Benin. Ambassador Ajebade, I grew up in DC, so there are going to be a couple of ambassadors that figure in some stories, and his family of 14 filled this house with their love, their food, and their skills in hairdressing. So many times in the 70s, when my parents were rocking their afros and wearing their bell-bottoms and going out to parties, they would drop their 2 children off to the household across the street that had like 12 children. They wouldn't even notice, right? And inevitably, we would come back with these amazing, amazing hairdos. So what I learned in that very, early in life is that the Ajebades, first of all, were from this part of West Africa where Yoruba people are from. They were Yoruba, by language, by culture, by religion. And the Yoruba believed that the head is the seat of the soul, not the heart, not your knee, not your butt, your head, right? So hairdressing is not just about vanity, it's about soul keeping. As a kid, I was sitting in between the legs, so that's pretty sacred space, of some cool teenager or young auntie kind of figure who would make sculpture and art on my body. These were early lessons for me to learn and to live. Having a grandmother who's teaching me how to stitch stories and having someone make art with my DNA. I knew that I was walking with craft on my head because this is the end of a hairstyle. You can see it sort of coming out over my shoulder. But people would stop me in the street and ask me who had done my hair. And I'd be like, the Ajebade sisters. And what was happening in their homeland in West Africa is that there was this photographer by the name of J.D. Ojikere. And J.D. Ojikere was photographing these same sort of thread-wrapped hairstyles that the Ajebade sisters were giving me, and photographing them as a sort of way of understanding that they weren't just beautiful, they were also evidence of a living culture, living sculpture, the way in which we negotiate our DNA and hold on to that sort of cultural relevance of it. So the thing is, that photograph that I showed you before, because this was way before iPhones, is one of the only photographs that my mother took of the fantastic hairstyles that I had. And it was towards the end of one of those hairstyles. So early in my career, I think I was still at UW-Madison at the time, I made this wig series to try and remember those hairstyles. I used millinery techniques. So I'm using buckram and forming that into these sort of scalp-like structures, then stitching through the buckram with black cotton thread, and then hairdressing. There is this thing that happens in cultures where hairstyles get particularly complex. The hairstyle is complex on the head, and then eventually people say, you know what would be a lot easier is just to make a wig off of this, right? And then eventually those wigs kind of turn into hats, right? So this is a tradition that I was sort of following, this idea from hairstyling to wig to hat. As a way of thinking again about hairstyling not being vanity, but being ritual, it being a language of something larger than ourselves, it being the language of our souls. Because it never hurts to quote Jimmy Baldwin more than once in a talk. I love to call him Jimmy like we knew each other. I did have the occasion when I was a student at Amherst College, James Baldwin came to give a talk at UMass just down the street in UMass Amherst. And many, many years later, I found this notebook where I wrote down this quote that I'm about to share with you, and then the page was filled with doodles after that. I suspect I was paying attention, but I only wrote down this quote: "We must find our lost crowns and wear them." So that directive that Jimmy gave that ended up in my notebook stayed in my mind and in my memory, even though at the time I wouldn't have claimed to be an artist, nor had I studied art at Amherst. This way of using hairstyling techniques as a way to talk about lineage is something that has recurred in my work. I'm hoping that you can see in this piece, Rooted and Uprooted, the visceral pull of heritage. There's a West African concept in which they will say that you don't know who you are unless you can name yourself 10 generations back. I love everything about that sentence. You don't know who you are unless you can name yourself 10 generations back. So that means you can name your parents and their parents and their parents, 10 generations back. Now, for some of us who have heritages like I do, that means on the most evident part of my heritage, which is my African heritage, I can't do that back 10 generations. My niece's grandchildren will be able to on the African side. But my mother's maiden name is McCarty. And like a lot of Jamaicans, there are a lot of Scots that made their way to Jamaica, and McCarty is a family name. My great-grandfather was from the Highlands of Scotland, less evident in my heritage, but true nonetheless. He and my grandmother, who was a woman of African descent, said to be a Moor from Spain, married in 1870. And I'd like to point out that it was 100 years later before that was legal in this country. They married in 1870. And I can go back easily on the Scottish side of my family, 10 generations, easily, because of the disruption of the slave trade and because of the records that were kept among the European part of my family. So the thing about Scots is that they think that textiles are pretty important. We know this because of tartans, right? Clan cloths. But in the Highlands of Scotland, there's this tradition of Clootie wells. Is that familiar to any of you, Clootie wells? Many Scots in the, there's got to be a couple of Scots in the house, right? Okay. Are there any Jamaicans in the house? Ah, okay, yeah. My people. The Scots and the Jamaicans are in the house. Okay, so so Clootie wells, Clootie is a word that means cloth. Clootie wells are naturally occurring wells in the Highlands, and what people do is they will take pilgrimages to these naturally occurring wells. Some of them are thought to be healing wells, and so but traditionally people would be wearing their clan cloth, their kilts. They would rip a piece of their clan cloth, put it into the Clootie well, and wash a part of their body that was afflicted. So this could be a troubled mind, a broken heart, or some physical affliction. And then they would tie that clan cloth to the nearest tree. Now people do it with t-shirts or whatever, right? You don't go to the Clootie well that has like 3 little pieces of cloth. That one's not powerful. The word is not out on that one. This one is advertising its power, right? Because of the presence of the people who have taken pilgrimages to it. So, but back to Jamaica. So this is why my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother ended up in Jamaica. This crop, sugarcane. This is why they ended up there. And I, like a lot of Jamaicans, you know, the national motto for Jamaica is out of many, one people. And all of you, and I mean every last one of you, could be at a family reunion. That's, my family looks like everybody in this room. And maybe a couple of other people as well. So I wanted to make a piece that talked about this heritage of mine. And so in the bottom right of in the bottom left of the left-hand image is a piece of the McCarty tartan woven in Scottish wool. And the roll of cloth that you see is 18 feet of that same plaid of the McCarty tartan, and I wasn't there for the design of it 500 years ago, so, you know, didn't get to choose it, but there is our plaid. But instead, woven out of bagasse. Bagasse is what is left over when you squeeze out all of the sugar of sugarcane, and then you have just the trash, just what's left. You know, you take the sweetness out, and the rest is just trash, right? But some very enterprising green designers have turned bagasse into a fiber, like a rayon-like fiber. And so I bought up all of that I could buy. It was actually people in Brazil who designed this, and the sugarcane industry is very large in Brazil, as most of you know. Dyed that cloth, and then, dyed the thread and then wove this cloth. 18 feet of it. So my sense was, because I wrote a grant about this, that the black people who are in Jamaica are bodies that were not even valued as much as this crop, right? You all understand where I'm going with this. They were just the leftovers, right? So to claim those leftovers and to turn that into clan cloth, right? I should be careful at how I use the word clan here. Scottish tartan. So, I decided that I was going to take this 18 feet of cloth and take it to my diasporic family spread all over the world. I love to travel. This is a great excuse. I was going to take these formal portraits of all my family members, right? Especially the elders, wrap them in this cloth. But what actually happened was that before I could do that, one of my aunties in Jamaica died. My Aunt Norma became an ancestor. And so I traveled very light, but I took this 18 feet of fabric and packed it in my very small suitcase and took it to this funeral and decided that said, well, I'm not sure if this is a good idea to put art in the middle of a funeral. So with a little bit of fear and trepidation, I took this piece out at the repast after the funeral. And my family all knows the McCarty tartan. They all know it. Some of them are crazy enough to show up from Scotland and England in Jamaica in the summertime in a kilt. So they all know it. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to take photographs of each one of you. But what happened was they just took the cloth and owned it. I don't have a single formal photograph, but everyone in my family who has been near this cloth has a selfie or multiple images of people with the cloth. In fact, after Aunt Norma's funeral, I had relatives who were not able to come to Jamaica for the funeral who said, so I'm hearing about this cloth you have. When are you coming? I need to be in the cloth. To people saying things like my cousin Anne, who's in the top left there, saying when she's the eldest cousin of my generation, about 20 years between us, she's in her 70s, and she said, if I should pass before you do, I would love to have my casket draped with this cloth. So I thought I was making art, but I was actually making heirloom. I might have been making a monument, this idea of cloth as monument to my family. So speaking of cloth as monument, I lived in Richmond, Virginia for 12 years. And though I grew up in DC, I hadn't spent much time in Virginia at all. And in 2010, when I made this piece, then Governor Bob This might not surprise you, but I didn't actually have an issue with that proclamation. What I had an issue with, because I do think we should always remember history so we don't repeat it, I had an issue with the fact that he didn't acknowledge any of the racial or social injustices or the contribution of African Americans. So we didn't get to the American flag we didn't get from the Confederate flag to the American flag without the contributions of African Americans and other ethnic groups as well, but I wanted to insert into this history what he was leaving out in his proclamation. And how I chose to do that was in the same technique that you saw before. I painted, this is not an actual flag, but I painted a flag on the surface of canvas, the Confederate battle flag, and then stitched through it with cotton thread. And then cornrowed the stripes and Bantu knotted the stars. So cornrows to stand in for the labor that provided so much wealth to this nation that African Americans provided. And even, I should tell you, in Jamaica they call cornrows, what we call cornrows here, cane rows, because of sugar cane, because that was the cash crop, right? So cornrows here, cane rows there. And then Bantu knots, which make the stars, and Bantu for the Bantu-speaking people on the continent, and to name the hairstyle as well. So the hairstyling techniques stand in for the people. Now, I made this piece, and it was being shown at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And the director of the Museum of the Confederacy looked me up and contacted me, and said, I'd love to bring you to the museum. And admittedly, I had not been to the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, but I was curious. So he invited me there to tell me a thing or two about the Confederate flag. The first thing he wanted to tell me is that shorthand, I call it the Confederate flag. He said, that's not the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag, there are several of them, but as we're talking about this one, he said that the Confederate flag is actually square, it's not a rectangle. So I just want to let you know that. Thank you. What I gained from the trip, though, is that he showed me one of the original Confederate battle flags, and this is a detail of one of them, the one that they have in the collection. It is a flag that is made out of silk, as many of those early flags were, made out of silk and wool, silk or wool. Silk, many of the Confederate women would give up their fine garments to be used to be making these flags. And so this is really early one of the design that we know so well. Was in a darkened room to prevent it from fading any further and behind glass to protect it. And when I attempted to take a photograph of its threadbare status, my face was reflected in the mirrored surface. Do you see that? You see the top of mine, the same, right, noggin here? So fast forward to 2015. A year in which we were witnessing something that happens in this nation a lot, but we were witnessing it in the press. The atrocities of policing, brutalizing, and murdering of black and brown bodies. It was undeniable what was happening. It is undeniable, but still somehow very few people get prosecuted for this modern day lynching. We know about plantations to prisons and the pipeline of that. Certainly you all know that here with the magnificent museums that EJI has set up just down the street. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to measure what power the Confederate battle flag would hold if I took it down, if I took down this monument to its bare threads. And so Unraveled is the work of a few studio assistants and myself taking apart this Confederate battle flag and segregating the threads in red, white, and blue. Do they still have power? Do they look like that's what then built the American flag? Oh, I forgot to tell you something that I found really fascinating. So the Confederate flag, you know, that X on it, it was in part, its design was in part inspired by the Scottish flag, which some of you know, because I know there's some Scots in the room, which also has this X. So there was a curator who wanted to show this work in 2015 at an exhibit in New York. Again, this was the sesquicentennial of the end of the Civil War. People mark that by April 9th of 1865 when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. And this piece lives sort of statically. There it is. That's the end game. But I found in many years of making work that if I engage people in my practice, then I am all the better for it. So I invited people in this exhibition on June 11th at the opening in New York to join me one by one. I was always constant on the right side of the flag, and one by one people would join me and I would show them how to unravel a flag. We would talk about cloth, how cloth is constructed, how symbols are constructed, and we would pull a thread at a time. I should let you know that it takes about 2 hours for me to engage 50 people, and we usually only get to about half an inch. That's how slow going it is. When I performed this piece with the 50 people who joined me on June 11th, that was a full 6 days before Dylan Roof committed mass murder of 9 people in Charleston, South Carolina. You all know that story. My father, who was a psychiatrist, often described racism as a kind of mental illness that was also very highly contagious. And he described it as something that some people suffer from, like a sneeze, and other people suffer from in much more detrimental ways. And that is what I think happened to Dylan Roof. But my father, a very dark-skinned black man, said, no one is immune. My friend Paul Rucker, who is a fantastic artist, please look him up if you don't know his work, recently said, the biggest force of white supremacy in this nation is not in fact the KKK. It's the normalization of systematic racism across all of our institutions. If we realize that it's sewn into the very fabric of our nation, we can do something to address and confront this legacy of slavery. So I want to talk to you about places in my life where the Confederacy has slipped in. I was 13 years old, and I had a crush on a boy. And my parents and the parents of the ambassador, the ambassador of Jamaica and his wife and their kids, we all decided we were going to get together with some other friends of the family, and in our janky Volvo, old Volvo, and their very fancy Benz, they put all these brown and black children, and we were going down the road to King's Dominion, the theme park King's Dominion, right between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. And I was excited because the boy I had a crush on was in the car with me. And we were all going to get on this very famous roller coaster because that was going to be some fun. And we got on the roller coaster ride, and the boy I had a crush on got buckled in with me, and he held my hand. And then they said, scream, yell, enjoy, yell like a rebel. The name of the ride was the Rebel Yell. as in the Confederate soldiers' rebel yell. Now, my parents and the Jamaican ambassadors and all the kids, we had no idea what that meant. Imagine giving the directive to black and brown children to give the rebel yell for fun. This is further conflated by I had a lot of fun that day I got my first kiss. This is a way that we have this sort of complex problem in the way that we tell history, that it just slips in like fun. I have some like lefty friends in Italy who said, I don't understand, Sonia, what's the problem with the Confederate flag? I mean, we all watched the Dukes of Hazzard and we loved it. Right, watch it again as an adult. And they were appalled, right? Because what slipped in as children, you see with old eyes, wiser eyes. This is a scale model of the rebel yell. It has since been renamed. Last year it was renamed. The piece actually has a sound component to it using archives from the Smithsonian of Confederate soldiers, veterans who were doing the rebel yell. It actually makes the piece quite haunting. So there are places in history where I wonder where we have had erasures and things that we don't know. Now, I'm going to have a hard time asking this question here, and I'm going to ask you guys to sort of divide yourselves this way. If you have been on my website or you've heard me give a talk before, and that is how you know what this object is, you may not answer this question. For the rest of you, do any of you know what this is? Dish rag. It is a dish rag. Well done. Is it? And what else? I'm hearing some other. A washcloth. Yeah, it's a dish rag. It's a dish rag. It is a dish rag that I think should be the monument that we know as well as that problematic battle flag of the Confederacy. This dishcloth ended the Civil War. None of you recognized it as such. And yet, it has some design elements, right? It's not just a dishcloth. It has these 3 red lines in it, too. It's got enough design element that if you were to see it again, you would recognize it. Why is it we don't know the cloth that ended the Civil War at Appomattox? But I was encouraged to be yelling the rebel yell for fun? Yes, why indeed? And it's not like it's a hidden cloth. I was doing research at the Smithsonian, and right next to Lincoln's top hat, why do we know his top hat so well and we don't know this, right? Anyway, Lincoln's top hat is the Confederate flag of truce. In fact, half of the Confederate flag of truce. So the cloth that brought the nation together, in fact, had been divided in half, and then the half that went to the South got further and further divided, right? So I made a faithful reproduction of it and sutured it back together. In fact, one of the things that I'm working on is making it into a monument that's 10 times the scale of the original, so it'll be 15 by 25 feet. Just to give you a sense, the waffle weave that makes a dishcloth very absorbent, in this case, those weaves are about this big, right? And then the madder-dyed red thread that'll be stitched through, which might have reference to the impending violence that happened in the Jim Crow era after the end of the Civil War and continues to this day. So I made this piece called Edifice and Mortar. It's not a textile piece, except I hope that you see that it refers to a flag. Yeah, do you see the upside down flagness of it? It's 13 bricks high. It has a blue mirror that at an angle reflects anybody who comes in front of it. The mortar of the brick is made up of African American hair gathered from black hair salons in Richmond, Virginia. And so the definition of an edifice is a large or imposing building or a complex system of beliefs. And of course, the mortar that you're seeing here is gathered up of the DNA of people of African descent who happened to live in Richmond at the time of the creation of this piece. I think about empires and empire building a lot. I spend a lot of time in Italy studying the Roman Empire and how that is an empire that was built on the backs of slavery as well, without the additional bit of race, but certainly an empire that was built on the back of slavery, and one in which this empire modeled itself after. The bricks are stamped with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that, and here we have one of the paradoxes of our nation, right? That slick blue mirrored surface of this sort of upside down flag reflects everybody who stands before the piece gets absorbed into that slick surface. One of the things that I was studying in my work, in my research, and some of you have seen these before in art history classes, are these ancient Roman brick stamps. This one happens to be from the 2nd century BC. And these brick stamps are evidence of the presence of an enslaved person. So in this crescent, on the outer, the name on the outside would be the person who owns the clay pit. The next ring would be the person who owns the person who is making the brick. And COS is the name of the enslaved person. Not all of them have that, but this one happens to. Now, when I see these, of course they look like afros to me, because how could they not? And so on the verso, on the back of that edifice and mortar, is stamped this, a maker's mark stamp. So it's an afro, clearly. And in that afro is a word, schiavo, S-C-H-I-A-V-O. The way it's pronounced in Italian is schiavo. The C-H makes a k sound. The V sounds like a V here. That's the way my Roman friends, like my friends in Rome, would say it in the Roman accent, schiavo. My friends who are from Venice, the CH gets softened, the V gets softened, and it turns to sciavo, right? You can see that the letters that are not stamped deep, but are slightly raised, are the word what? Ciao. See how you all knew that? I didn't have to tell you how to pronounce it or anything. The word schiavo is etymologically directly related to the word ciao. And ciao is a greeting, like hi, goodbye. It's like aloha. You can, it's warm, it's friendly. The word schiavo means slave. When we say ciao to one another, we are saying, I am your slave. I am serious. Yeah, who said, did someone say, are you serious? Yeah, yeah. So I've made a lot of work about that because I find that fascinating. So complicated relationships, even for the emancipator, partially black on his mother's side, explains why he looks better with an afro. Also, I would not be standing here before you if it weren't for him. I do not sell this piece and the pieces that are derived from this for $5. And that means that the thing that makes this piece valuable is, in fact, the afro. So it's a little like reparations. Okay. Because I'm a first-generation American, I often try and, I think of myself as being from the deep, deep South, Caribbean, deep, deep South. And so I made this piece encrusted in which I grew sugar crystals on a $5 bill, really thinking about the slippage between sugar, a major commodity of the transatlantic slave trade, also that sugar preserves, but it also rots. And the idea that Lincoln abolished slavery in the US, but very quickly started backsliding on a lot of things. So what remains of the institution, even Lincoln's legacy, is often sugar-coated. And I also wanted to use sugar in an empowered way. So I made this piece of pastillage, and pastillage is a sugar paste that was made popular by Queen Victoria in the 1800s. And the form of this piece, clearly these are teeth, is inspired by Nanny in The Queen, who I'll explain to you who she is, and Eduardo Galeano's Queen of the Free. Nanny was a maroon. She was like the Harriet Tubman of Jamaica. She was an enslaved woman who was brought to the Americas, brought to Jamaica in particular, and she escaped slavery and went into the cockpit country, this really rough terrain, and the Blue Mountains in Jamaica. This is actually not very far from where my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather met, and where the family homestead is. Let me read to you this poem from Eduardo Galeano. It's called Queen of the Free. It happens in the first half of the 18th century. The International Division of Labor decides that Jamaica exists to sweeten Europe's table. The land produces sugar, and more sugar. In Jamaica, as in Brazil, diversity is a diet of privilege for those who escape. Although the fertile land is hard to find in the high mountains, the Maroons figure out how to grow everything and even raise pigs and chickens. Hidden here, they see without being seen, they sting, and then they vanish. In the windward Blue Mountains, Nanny has her temple and her throne. She is the queen of the free. Once a machine for birthing slaves, now she wears necklaces made of the teeth of British soldiers. I was raised in Washington, D.C. The reason that my family ended up in Washington, D.C. is that my father worked his way through college at Howard University. And so that meant that in D.C., there's like this middle class, upper middle class people of professionals, and I grew up in a neighborhood like that, where there were a number of doctors and lawyers and businessmen and women. The neighborhood is no longer called this, but the neighborhood when I was growing up was called the Gold Coast. And I assure you, we were not the 1%, but we were doing all right. It's ironic that it was called the Gold Coast, sort of, except that it's this way of referring to the Gold Coast, i.e. Ghana, right? Because black people were living in this neighborhood, and we had decent houses and decent cars, and kids got to go to decent schools, right? Gold Coast, DC, Gold Coast, Ghana. So I made this piece. It is the size of a real spool. It's hand carved from African ebony wood. The length of the gold, and it is made of 18 karat, the thread is 18 karat wire, hair thin. And it is scaled inches to miles of the distance between the former Gold Coast, Ghana, and Richmond, Virginia, the second largest port for human trafficking at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. The first time I went to Ghana, I had this experience of like a real life experience of just how much race is a construct. No one in this room, I'm thinking, would have any trouble identifying me as an African American person or a person of African descent. Am I right about that? Nobody went, oh, that's a nice Scottish lad. You all probably didn't do that, right? And I'm very comfortable with this. This is how I identify as a black person. When I went to Ghana, however, the very first time, people called me a Bruni. A Bruni is a word for white person. And the reason that they called me a Bruni is not because they didn't catch the texture of the hair or the brown in my skin. They just draw the color line in a different place. And it really made me think about how arbitrary that color line is drawn. Here, it's like the 1/16th rule, right? As if whiteness tainted with a little bit of brownness is forever tainted. And there they just flip it. They're just like, well, you're sort of lighter skinned than your average Ghanaian, so someone in your family must have been white. That is also true. And they just put me in the white camp with all the uncomfortable privileges that came with that. And I mean privileges, like let the Bruni go to the front of the line, right? So this is an Albers piece, right? Joseph Albers being the great color theorist and painter and dean at Yale School of Art for many years. What you're looking at is the back of thread-wrapped combs, right? So these are fine-tooth plastic combs. They're thread-wrapped. The squares on either side, those little squares on both pieces are the same color, but they get pushed to different directions because of what's surrounding them. So the one on the left is an Albers classic. Like, I think with the Interaction of Color, his seminal book, has a version of this done in color aid and color paper, and I did it with combs. His wife, Annie Albers, was a weaver, and I wanted to acknowledge the textile in that way. And then the one on the right is my version of the story that I just told you. You're surrounded by European people, that's the dominant culture. You seem more black. You're surrounded by darker people, you seem more white. I made this piece called Passing, where it's more evident that I'm using combs. This piece is 15 feet long, and obviously using the marking of street signage to talk about what it means to pass or not pass. I think that passing is a really strange thing, because when we talk about passing, like racially passing, what we're saying is, you're a person that we've called black by this racial construct. Clearly you have enough European heritage to pass for white, but actually you're tainted by your blackness. And so you're trying to get over, right? It's ridiculous, right? But we know where the ridiculousness comes from. It comes from the age-old white supremacy that is part of the fabric of this nation. So passing, whose hair can pass through a fine-tooth comb or not. And no passing, which also has reference to borders and border control. The circle is made by the natural arc of just wrapping one half of the comb, and what naturally happens is that comb gets thicker just on that edge, and that determines the size of the circle itself. It's about 4 feet across. I've used fine-tooth combs to acknowledge people like Madam C.J. Walker. Does anybody know who she was? Yes, right up here up front. You want to tell us? Did you say the first woman millionaire? Yes, okay, I love that, because people often say that she is the first black woman millionaire, which is true. However, she was the first woman millionaire, self-made, like she didn't inherit any money. And she was kick-ass because her people were enslaved. She was born in 1867, I was born in 1967, so I feel connected. She died 100 years ago in this year, so I've made a whole show in honor of her. She was an unbreakable spirit. She is known, she made that money on the business of hair care, right? She made that money on the business of hair care. Because money talks in this nation, she was invited to boardrooms, even though she was a black woman, which meant she couldn't vote for 2 reasons. But she had money, and therefore she had power in the boardroom. She was an anti-lynching activist. Haters will talk about how she popularized the use of straightening hair combs and that sort of thing. I really don't have an issue with that, because she was badass and she was working on anti-lynching campaigns, so she was about business. And there was a lot of business that was happening in hair salons, and she was empowering black women. She was like the Mary Kay of her day. And this is the famous Addison Scurlock photograph of her that I used to make this piece. You've noticed probably that these combs are stamped unbreakable. In order to make the portrait, I actually had to break them. Because while she is unbreakable, those combs are intended for hair unlike hers, right? And intended to be unbreakable, but I broke them to make space for her visage. In her own words, this is one of her most famous quotes. I am a black woman from the cotton fields of the South. I was promoted to the wash tub. I was promoted to the kitchen. I promoted myself to the business of hair on my own ground. This is the first piece that I made in 2019. It is called For Colored Girls, a Rainbow. Some of you will know that that makes reference to the late Notasaki Shange, who wrote a beautiful piece of 20 separate poems in 1976. These poems weave interconnected stories of love, empowerment, struggle, and loss into a complex representation of sisterhood The name of the piece was For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When a Rainbow Is Enough. The cast consists of 7 nameless African-American women, only identified by the colors they are assigned: the lady in red, the lady in orange, the lady in yellow, etc. This is an Afro wig with thread-wrapped combs pushed into the center of it. The idea of bringing textiles and hair together, I think you see that theme. Sometimes I let my body, as that small child, let my body be the repository for the art, be the art gallery. And then sometimes I'm stitching thread through canvas and letting that stand in for hairstyling techniques. A friend of mine, Bill Gassens, once said that in talking about my work, he said that hairdressing was a primordial fiber art, and I love that. And if hairdressing and textiles are first cousins, then I decided to go to hairdressers and see if they could do my hair. Of course they could. And then could they do these canvases as well? So these are some of the women who were part of the Haircraft project. I'm not going to speak about this too much because there is a catalog that's available for anybody who's interested. These are these kick-ass women from, pardon my French, from Richmond who agreed to be part of this project. They did my hair. They did these canvases. We could not have done it without one another. They were paid for doing their work. Of course, they were paid for giving me a hairstyle. They were paid for doing the canvases. The canvases then were part of Art Prize, and then they won Art Prize. So all the women got paid for being part of the project, and some of them started going, maybe I should give up my hairdressing business. And I said, no, no, no. Come into my studio, let me show you. I am the biggest collector of my own artwork. But we couldn't have done it. You know, this, to go together means that we could go farther. And now the project belongs to the MFA Boston, and when the MFA and the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston acquired it, I wrote everybody a check again, and I still said, do not quit your day job. I'm a teacher, I haven't quit mine. I want to show you just a few last pieces. I want to show you some work that actually is using hair again, but also incorporates sound. This is a dear friend of mine. Her name is Regina Carter. She is a genius. I mean that. She's a MacArthur Fellow. And Regina and my husband toured together. My husband is a musician. They toured together for many years. And Regina was coming down to Richmond to do a recording with my husband. And I said, Regina, you know, I've re-haired a violin bow. It took me a long time to figure this out, like hairing a violin bow. You can re-hair a violin bow with human hair, a dreadlock made from my own hair, and very, very, very expensive hair that I bought on the market, human hair that appears to be blonde. And I said, Regina, will you put that MacArthur-winning skill of yours to the test and see if we can get any sound out of this? And she said yes, and then she allowed me to record it. So I'm going to play for you a remastered version of just a short part of Lift Every Voice and Sing as it activates my DNA from my ancestors. Let me tell you what is, why I played the remastered version for you, because actually two geniuses are implied here. So Jason Moran, who is an amazing composer and pianist, also in jazz, he and I became friends, and when I played the straight recording for him, he literally was like, gimme, 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 can I have that? And so he remastered it, and he slowed down Regina's playing, the timbre of it, that is to say, the color of the sound and the texture of the sound. with an even slower version. So what you hear underneath is almost like a creaking ship. And Jason knew that was going to happen. My artwork is so much better when I have other people help me out with it. So I have two more slides that I want to share with you. One is the one that I showed you really quickly, this one. So you can see what I did. I put some hairballs on a Remington noise list because I wanted to talk about the voice of African American authors and the voice of African American stories. But that led me naturally to say, well, what would that typewriter actually print? And so I worked very closely with a graphic designer by the name of Bo Peng to help me design a font that was based on the curl of my own hair. This is also pushing back at some hegemony that we take for granted. There's an author, a brilliant thinker, that I'm surprised that he hasn't won a Nobel Prize yet, an author by the name of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote this book called Decolonizing the Mind. And in this book, it's a short, sweet book. In it, he appeals to other African writers on the continent to write in their native languages as opposed to the languages of the colonizer. That makes sense. The preservation of language. There's a way that language, something shifts when things are written in other languages. Things are lost. But I realized that even in Ngugi wa Thiong'o, when wa Thiong'o asked people to do this, they're still, when those things get typed, what are they typed in? They're typed in Roman script. Like that hegemony of Western culture is still carrying the language, right? So I want all of those African texts to be written in this. And then I had to teach people how to read it. I didn't know, I called this a hair font for a long time, and then I asked, because I like brilliant people, so, and all of you are brilliant, I love brilliant minds, so Rita Dove, who is a poet laureate of our nation and has won 2 presidential medallions, one from Clinton and one from Obama, she named this for me, and she named it Twist. The very last image that I want to share with you is from a project that I did. A friend of mine who is a poet, he runs a poetry project in Miami called Oh Miami. And he invites artists and poets to come down, and the charge is so simple. In the month of April, which is Poetry Month, he invites artists to come and try and expose everyone in Miami-Dade County to a poem. And so it can be a very small intervention or it can be a very large intervention. So of course when he invited me, I said, I want to be in barbershops and salons. And he said, okay. And I said, all I'm gonna ask people to do is, and I stole this idea, by the way, because I'm a good, like good artist stealing. So we came up with the idea of a haircut for a poem. And I asked people gentlemen in a barbershop. It was the first time I was working with gentlemen in particular. So I was asking gentlemen in 2 barbershops in black neighborhoods, Little Haiti and Overtown. And I asked gentlemen to read a poem, and they would get a free haircut. This is a poem I asked them to read. It was written by Calvin Herndon, who was a professor at Oberlin College. And the poem is called The Distant Drum. I am not a metaphor or a symbol. This you hear, it's not the wind in the trees or a cat being maimed in the street. I am being maimed in the street. It is I who weep, laugh, feel pain or joy. And I speak this because I exist. I am a poet. These words are my words. My mouth speaks them, my hand writes. It is my fist you hear beating against your ear. Thank you. there is some terrific artwork in a gallery just around the corner. Anybody who wants to ask me some questions, I'm happy to entertain your questions and have dialogue with you. But let's go see some art by some wonderful people who I've had the privilege of getting to know here, and some who I haven't even met yet. Shall we? All right.